The Minister of Finance has secured approval for 5 loans totaling $3.45 billion from the Federal Executive Council. These funds are earmarked for projects that will bolster the power sector, renewable energy, revenue generation, education, and women's empowerment. Also approved is the Humanitarian and Poverty Alleviation Trust Fund, with a governing board that hopes to raise at least $5 billion annually. State House correspondent Adesua Moron has more.
It's another session of the Federal Executive Council meeting where several decisions were reached that touch upon crucial aspects of the Nigerian society. Ministers took turns to present the approvals secured for their respective ministries. To enhance rapid responses to humanitarian crises like floods and emergencies, the Council authorized the establishment of a Humanitarian and Poverty Alleviation Trust Fund.
Every year, we hope to be able to raise at least $5 billion within this fund. And this is from the different sectors. So we're going to have contribution from government, of course, from the private sector, development partners, individuals, philanthropic individuals, and other innovative form of crowdfunding.
Given the increasing number of out-of-school children and the country's dwindling statistics in this regard, there was a strong focus on educational empowerment for adolescent girls and out-of-school children during the meeting.
Initially, from 7 participating states, we now have 11 additional states participating in this project, which will lead to the empowerment of girls between 10 to 20 right across the participating states. This is a very major escalation of this program that is meant to empower our girls, our teachers, and the provision for additional schools in the country.
The Minister of Finance elaborates on the country's financing plans for projects aimed at empowering the girl child and improving various sectors, including power, totaling $3.45 billion.
They were to do with concessional and in many cases zero interest financing by the World Bank and the International Development Association. And as you know, the tenure is upwards of, is all around 40 years, moratorium period around 10 years, and interest very low, or in the cases of the IDA loans, zero interest, although some fees would occur.
As the nation seeks to diversify from oil, the Minister of Solid Minerals, with approval for a policy against illegal mining, is confident that it would be a new era in the sector.
This time around, we are injecting a large dose of technology. Yes, we have a very vast land area and porous borders as well. So the incidence of illegal mining is very, very pervasive, especially in the rural areas. And we've also traced incidents of banditry to the handiwork of illegal miners, especially foreign illegal miners.
Furthermore, the Council ratified the protocol for the protection of older persons in the country, aligning with the African Charter to safeguard the rights and dignity of older individuals and protect them from discrimination. Adesua Omoruan, Arise News.
President Bola Tinubu addressed business community concerns at the 29th Nigerian Economic Summit, reassuring it that measures are being implemented to enhance foreign exchange liquidity in Nigeria. He pled to honor all legitimate foreign exchange contracts to clear a significant backlog and boost investor confidence. That backlog, estimated at around $10 billion, has strained local Nigerian banks, causing corresponding banks to suspend several transactions. This has mounted pressure on the Nigerian currency, the naira, at the parallel market and the official exchange window, raising concerns about its further depreciation.
The 5 sub-themes: stimulating economic growth, mobilizing finance for sustainable economic development, harnessing human capital, reforming public institutions, and promoting national cohesion, and inclusion are consistent with my administration's Renew Hope agenda. And we are confident that this summit will serve as a platform for translating our strategic vision into action and result with collaboration with you. After a decade dominated by 2 economic recessions and a global pandemic, we find ourselves coming into federal administration at a time that is laden with even more challenging socio-economic conditions than was the case in 1993, the year of the very first Nigerian Economic Summit. Combined global economic growth is projected not only to stagnate but slide into a reverse trajectory over the next fiscal year from 3.5 million % growth recorded in 2022 down to 3.0 in 2023 and 2024.
Well, a lot to talk about, Ken Rufai. Yesterday, the president was at the opening ceremony of the Nigerian Economic Summit, and tongue twist there. But also, very importantly, earlier on, we'd seen that he also presided over a FEC meeting following 1 week after the second one held last week. Your thoughts on this?
Yep, it's good to see the president attending the Economic Summit. But first, let's talk about the FEC meeting. The FEC meeting, the Minister of Information and National Orientation came out to say that, yes, now they've moved it to every Monday. So if it is every Monday...
No, not every Monday.
No, well, he said it will be held on Mondays. Yes, I stand to be correct. I accept the correction. He said every Monday when it is possible and when they deem it important to have the meeting. Now, I do wonder, on which week of the year or the month would you say that there is nothing important to discuss in Nigeria? I cannot think of one. The whole of this week, we're only Tuesday today. We're not even on Wednesday yet. And the number of things that has happened in Nigeria that requires the federal government to meet, discuss, strategize, and plan is many. So by the time we get to next Monday, if there's no FEC meeting, you begin to wonder, are these people watching what's going on in the country? If they're not, then we have a serious challenge on our hands that our government is not actually watching what's going on. So saying that it's only when it's important means that they've given themselves the freedom to not have to hold it and say that we did say that it will hold on Mondays only when we think it is necessary. Every week is necessary. But talking about the Nigeria Economic Summit, that one is also good. Not all the presidents have attended every year. It's an annual. It's the epic. It's the most buoyant economic summit in Nigeria with all the captains of industry attending and all that. So it's good to see the president attending the first one of his government. Now, the third thing I wanted to mention is the fact that I am worried that we're going to take loan for poverty alleviation. It's unsustainable as far as I'm concerned. But in the same vein, I will commend the government that they're looking at education and health. These are the two areas that are most ignored in Nigeria for the last 20, 30 years. And that's why our health system or sector is in serious trouble and our education is almost nowhere. Except for the private universities and private secondary and primary institutions, our public sector education is in dire need of government support and funding. So if they're taking loans to support that, our health and our education, well done. Kudos to the president and the government. But I hope that that money goes to the right thing in terms of infrastructure development and strategy for those children to have good education in public school, and also to make sure that our health sector is doing well. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Kay. Fine.
So a couple of things. Monday FEC meeting, 3.5 billion to be borrowed from World Bank. Here we go again. If you read the mid-term expenditure framework, talks about the fact that we'll have to borrow about 26 trillion in the space of 3 years as a benchmark, to be able to meet most of our developmental prospects and encumbrances. And this money being borrowed, even if, as Mr. Finance Minister Wale Edun said, some of them are concessionary 40 years and all of that, it's still a loan you have to pay back. But the question is, it's not that loans are bad, but what do you use them for? Over the years, we've seen that what we use our loans for has been couched around corruption and ineffectiveness, and we don't see anything out of it. So when the APC government came about 8 years ago, they started couching this idea of, social welfare government and all of that. But the question is, when you take the empirical stats, has it worked? What happened to the school feeding program? What happened to the trader money? What happened to the market money? How did those things move the needle as regards bringing people out of poverty? I think what the government should focus on, yes, you can also couch an argument around social interventions, but the government should focus predominantly on boosting the economy. Because if the economy grows, then you can have all-round GDP growth and you can create more job money feeds back into the system. And also the social intervention should be tied around timelines, so we don't copy things in full. The likes of Bolsa Familias of this world in Brazil that you copy, they tie it around timelines. Okay, if your child goes to school, you get this money. All right, they know that at some point it will terminate because your child will have gotten an education and will go into the employment market. But if the children get out of school, what employment market are they going to? So that's the conversation we need to have. And they said they're going to have a governance board, for this new 5 billion trust fund. I just hope the governance board does things effectively. But I also want to talk about the NASG. A lot of promises were made that are not feasible. I'll give you one. This talk about Nigeria $1 trillion economy by 2026, to me it's not feasible. And I'll give you empirical calculations. Today Nigeria is 395 billion GDP. Hypothetically, it's not possible. Nigeria will not grow 20%. Hypothetically, if Nigeria grows 20%, what will happen is that you add 79 billion to the GDP. Iterate 79 billion by 20% constant growth for the next 3 years. It will give you 237 billion. 237 billion plus the 395 billion we have today will just give you a little over 600 billion, maybe 637 billion. So that's how well we can grow. So this idea of 1 trillion, I just think is another political poetry. 1 trillion GDP 2026. I think the government too should also tell people the realistic expectations. This 10 billion too that they said will be coming in for capital injection, where will the money be coming in from? Is it also part of the Afrexim 3.5 billion that we don't know about? So, and when the money comes in, we plunge into the forex market. So what happens next after all of this? Because we have built a culture where we have over-dependence on the dollar, but we forget that we don't print the dollar in this country. So when we plunge that into the foreign exchange market, what happens next afterwards? Where are we going to get more liquidity? Or is it going to drive liquidity? Our argument for floating the currency in the first place was because we wanted liquidity. Yeah. So we wanted to open up our economy in such a way that foreign investors will come and put liquidity in. But they have not put liquidity in because there still some constraints. So it's time for us to sort out the bureaucratic bottlenecks and the hitherto cultural problem, the legacy problems, and be able to free our economy. So the government should be realistic with what it can do to the people, and let's help build this economy.
All right. Well, very quickly, the $10 billion loan you talked about, according to BISDE had done research on it, and it's meant to be sourced from two sources. One is from a facility, forward sales by the NNPC, which could yield $7 billion, and the rest, the balance of that, the $3 billion, would come in from Qatar, which would give a soft loan with no strings attached, according to what has been, what has been said. So two ways they're hoping to get that $10 billion to pump into the economy so that it could potentially resolve this FX crisis that this government finds and Nigerians find on their hands. Now, I'll just speak on one other aspect of what the president said yesterday at the NSG and some questions. Talking about being realistic, especially when it comes to promises, we must realize that this is no longer campaign season. It's now the business of governance, and therefore Nigerians ought, we need to have realistic, smart promises being made by smart, obviously specific, measurable, and the likes, time-bound. Now, he also talked about the fact that they would roll out the student loan come January. That's one of the things he touched on yesterday when he addressed the summit. And a few questions around that, because the Higher Education Act of 2023 makes a provision for the setting up or the establishment of an education bank. That hasn't been done yet. Also on research, you would find out that the modalities, the processes as stipulated by law in that act have not yet been put in place. So it is quite, it's difficult to see how that would work out in the next 2 months in order to roll out the student loan promised by the president to begin in January. Maybe we'll get more clarity on that when he, from a statement from his spokespeople. But just to address that if we are to have the loans, because he acknowledged the hardship of students following hikes, in student fees across some institutions in Nigeria, and the fact that he had promised on assumption of office that there would be student loan. Now, away from that, still talking about his efforts, this government's efforts to address the needs of the most vulnerable in Nigeria, the Minister for Humanitarian Affairs and Poverty Alleviation, Dr. Betta Edu, as you saw in that video earlier, had addressed or given a statement on what had ensued during the FEC meeting. Now, this is quite important because this administration has shown its commitment to addressing the needs of, to alleviating poverty. Hence the reason for, this attention on the ministry and the fact that they were looking to have an annual $5 billion fund. This isn't the first time this has been announced. If you recall, in September, on the sidelines of ONGA, she had made this announcement that this funding would come from 30% would come from the government, 70% would come from other sources. These sources include private investments and also some development agencies, giving to that. Again, the taste of the pudding is in the eating. They've given a quite a broad view as to how this will be managed. But perhaps in order to avoid practices, let me put it that way, of the past, where we didn't see as much the evidence of the beneficiaries or how the monies were spent, we need to have tighter system structures when it comes to trust funds like this. It is impressive, it is good that this government is thinking ahead in terms of how to ensure that those who are most vulnerable, at risk of being affected by flooding and other crises, will be attended to. But it's important, very important, to ensure that they get the structure right. And perhaps in the next few days, that's what we'll be hoping to hear from the ministry as to how this will be implemented. Let's not forget they've begun to disburse the 25,000 naira, at least meant to start this month up until the next year. That's also still on ground. How is that being disbursed? There was news about the fact that you must have a bank account, NIN and the likes, which is great because we must be able to trace how much was being spent, who are the beneficiaries, and how well this impact is in terms of meeting the needs of the underserved in Nigeria. So overall, some good news from the FEC meeting, and has already been established. We're hoping that we'll have more meetings or frequency in terms of weekly. To be fair, the current state of the economy almost deserves meetings twice a week. But I believe that even if they don't have a FEC meeting every week, the individual ministries and ministries that would work together would meet in different groups. Move on to our next story. The Supreme Court has reserved judgments in the appeals filed by Atiku Abubakar of the People's Democratic Party and Peter Obi of the Labour Party, challenging the judgment of the Presidential Election Tribunal, which affirmed the Electoral Commission's declaration of President Tinubu as the winner of the election held on February the 25th. Arise News correspondent Godfrey Eshemoge has more.
The legal battle over who won Nigeria's presidential election has got to the final stage, Nigeria's highest court. And the stakes are pretty high as all parties in the matter unveil their strategy at this crucial moment where there are no second chances. The academic records of President Bola Tinubu from the Chicago State University were mentioned early during the proceedings as Atiku Abubakar, through his counsel, Chris Uche, prayed the 7-member panel headed by Justice Inyang Okoro to allow the fresh evidence to establish allegations of forgery and lying under oath against Tinubu. But one of the justices on the panel, Justice Emmanuel Agim, told Atiku's lead counsel that the deposition which he sought to tender as evidence was done in the chamber of Atiku's lawyer and not in the court as required by law, and states that this is a matter of national interest. In his response, Uche submitted that the legal system in the United States is different from that of the English legal system, which is practiced in Nigeria, and confirmed that the depositions were made in the law chambers of Atiku's American lawyer, with representation by Tinubu's American lawyers. Tinubu's lawyer, Wole Olanipekun, objected to the admissibility of fresh evidence, insisting that such depositions have to be adopted by the individual that deposed to it before it can be admitted as evidence before a court. The presiding justice, Iyan Okoro, observed that the issue of conflicting documents from the same institution is a serious criminal act which ought to be proved beyond reasonable doubt. The Apex Court also reserved judgment in the appeal of Labour Party's Peter Obi, who also asked for the nullification of Tinubu's electoral victory. In another development, the Apex Court also dismissed the appeal brought before it by the Allied People's Movement (APM) against the judgment of the Presidential Election Petition Court following an application for its withdrawal by APM's lead counsel, Chukwuma Machuku Ume. APM's case was one of double nomination, the same case the Supreme Court had previously dealt with. After today's proceedings, it's looking very likely that the Supreme Court panel, 7-member panel, may decide 5th of November the appeals, the remaining 2 appeals, those of Atiku Abubakar of PDP and the Labour Party's Peter Obi, with respect to what they feel is the actual outcome of the presidential election held on the 25th of February. Their decision, of course, will have a total sense of finality. From the Supreme Court venue of the hearing, Godfrey Ashamoge, Arise News.
Well, thanks, Godfrey. Kay, your thoughts on this?
Well, there's not much to say about it. It's a case in court. Supreme Court will have reserved judgment, and like Jeffrey said, we'll have to wait until November, I think. That is when they will have the decision of the court based on all the matters presented before the court. So we'll wait and hope that the judgment will be fair, will be just, and will show that the judiciary in Nigeria has got eyes on them and they do the right thing for the sake of the future of our democracy and for the sake of the nation. Rufai?
I mean, I think very soon we'll know the judgment. I think they're giving a benchmark date for the 5th of November. So, I mean, fingers crossed, it's going to culminate into the end of the electoral process. What the Supreme Court rules about all of this and all these petitions filed and, you know, all these appeals, then we know that it's the end of electoral process. And what remains is the Court of Public Opinion that will keep talking about it and keep reviewing it. But most importantly, I think the most important part of all of this is the fact that, yes, based on the report yesterday, we have seen a drop in the number of, you know, appeals in the court because the APM withdrew their case yesterday, and that was also struck out. So the lawyers now have, you know, less work to be able to review that of Atiku and Obi and the reserved judgments. I mean, the courts, beg your pardon, the judges now have less work to be able to review just both cases. So we just will look, you know, with bated breath and fingers crossed and see how it pans out. But just to echo the issues we talked about yesterday, the need for more lawyers on the bench, welfare of the lawyers and all of that. And Nigerians, you know, when nominations start getting made for those who are going to sit on the bench, we need to be able to look at these people and scrutinize them and, you know, air our opinions and air our voices out. And we just hope that a day comes in Nigeria that we don't need to go through the whole rung of the court after the people have voted to be able to make determination of elections. And that's why election reforms are key in the country and institutions must be held accountable.
Yes, absolutely. As has been said, in a few days, in a matter of days actually, we would get to hear the judgment of the Supreme Court. However, I think very notable during yesterday's proceedings were some of the questions asked by the justices, led by Mr. Justice Chris Okoro, a 7-member panel of the Supreme Court, especially when there was an argument from Atiku Abubakar's camp, his lawyer, Mr. Chris Uche, as to the admittance of fresh evidence, in this case, the deposition from CSU, and a few questions which might give an indication of the trajectory of this particular case. The justices had asked why the evidence had been submitted beyond the 180 days stipulated for matters like this, matters of election petition. And the lawyer tried to argue his case about the process he had taken them to obtain the information from the United States. Also bringing into question as well that this is a matter of national unity and it's quite critical. But again, it would be up to the courts to determine if they'll be willing to admit this evidence. Well, a few questions around there, which, you know, the justice justices had asked, and Mr. Chris Uche had tried to explain as to why it was important to admit that. They're also, looking at the distinction between how cases are run. Godfrey Eshemoge in his report had highlighted that as well. I think it's just important to understand in terms of the details of the case, and at the end of the day, we cannot preempt, we cannot project, we cannot, go ahead in terms of trying to decide, trying to guess or trying to see how the case will turn out to be until we hear and see the final judgments of their justices. Just important to mention that just had a few pressmen in the court yesterday, a few allowed to witness the proceedings, and as you would see, a few matters have come up. But again, as I've mentioned, we look forward to bringing you the reports as to the final judgment of the Supreme Court, particularly on this matter, and just to remember that all parties, at least Mr. Atiku Abubakar had mentioned that this would be the end of the road for them. It is the end of the road. The Supreme Court is the final arbiter at the end of the day, and perhaps the matter of governance and can stand in earnest. I think it's important, the conversation we'll be having in the next few minutes, or in a few minutes, with Professor Tahir Ujega, the former INEC chairman, just to see how we can strengthen the institution, because a number of people have criticized the process as to why we have litigations upon litigations, petitions upon petitions following an election cycle, because the process itself is not what it ought to be. So stay tuned for that particular interview. I believe it will be very insightful.